Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policy, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender Californians have watched with alarm and sadness in the last several months as conservative Republican lawmakers in the Midwest and the South have debated the rights and freedoms and put limitations on those rights and freedoms of young persons in the LGBTQ communities in their states and their parents and teachers and allies, whether transgender children can play in youth sports leagues or high school teams, whether teachers can discuss same-sex relationships or families in the classroom, or even say the word gay at all, and whether parents who help their children seeking gender-affirming care will be investigated for abuse. For the LGBTQ community, especially the young people, the latest attacks and threats feel, at the very least, deflating and jarring after years of apparent progress and deeper affirmation. And they fear the worst-case scenario, that this divisive rhetoric and policy will barrel forward across the country, leading to a clawback of important protections that already felt assured and sacred. Well, this time around on Then There's California, we'll discuss the bigotry and political selfishness that are masquerading as values and increasingly becoming law in certain parts of the country, the impact it's having on LGBTQ youth and the community at large, and we'll clarify and celebrate the progressive policies and the welcoming open arms of those of us here on the left coast, here in California, where we do care, and we've already begun to position ourselves as a refuge and sanctuary for an increasing number of LGBTQ persons escaping restrictive laws in other states. State Senator Scott Wiener is a member and former chair of the state legislature's LGBTQ caucus, representing the 11th Senate District in California, including all of the city of San Francisco. And he continues his distinguished and nationally respected work of advocacy and effort for LGBTQ and human rights legislation and causes. Senator Wiener is also chair of the Senate Housing Committee, where we see his tireless efforts to make housing in California more affordable, accessible, and plentiful. We last talked to Senator Wiener in the early summer of 2020 as the LGBTQ community in California and across the country was preparing for its first pandemic celebration of Pride Month. Glad to have you with us again, Senator Wiener. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
How are you on this first day of June as we speak?
Doing well. We're in a busy point in our legislative calendar, so it's been a little crazy lately, but I'm doing well.
Well, let me be the first, maybe, to wish you happy Pride for June 2022. I know it's been 2 years since the pandemic, and that, of course, made Pride organizers at that time, and even last year, think a little bit out of the box. I guess this year, it's going to be a little more normal and in person. Is that right?
Yeah, in San Francisco and a number of other cities, the Pride Parade will be back, so we'll be able to celebrate in person and just really be who we are, and I'm really looking forward to it.
And I even read there was a Pride Parade or Pride being celebrated in a very conservative part of Northern California in Placer County for the first time. So we're making some inroads here in certain parts of the state where Pride has not necessarily been embraced up till now.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is so many smaller cities and small towns even are celebrating Pride, and it might be a very small thing where 20 or 30 people are gathering and celebrating, but it's awesome to see it, the spirit of Pride spreading to so many parts of our state and the country.
I didn't initially plan on having this discussion with you as part of a Pride Month commemoration, but I know for a community that has now spent generations fighting against bigotry and discrimination and fighting for equity and protection in relationships and in the workplace, in healthcare access and in education, then comes this contagion of new attacks and regressive laws that threaten to set back the community and set us all back. So I imagine the feelings of pride during this month of June are sort of tempered with some anger and frustration and fear. It's a tough time.
Yeah, I mean, I came of age as a gay man in the 1980s, which is a very bleak time period. It was the worst part of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in this country. It was a time when we had a president, Ronald Reagan, who was completely hostile to our community. And then I started working in the community in 1990, and things were starting to turn around then, and we ultimately got a president who was more supportive, and we started just seeing more support in Hollywood and culturally, and we spent several decades. We had our ups and downs, absolutely, and there were always right-wing backlashes, but we were making steady progress. And what's been happening in the last couple of years, and it's been accelerating, has honestly been both terrifying and demoralizing. We see the Pandora's box has been open, as it has in so many areas, with a renewal of fascism and Nazism and attacks on the basic concept of democracy and trying to steal elections. But we see people just openly expressing homophobia and transphobia, and the attack is on the entire LGBTQ community. It's most intense around trans people, but it's against all of us. When we look at what's happening in Florida with the Don't Say Gay law, or calling all of us groomers or pedophiles, and then the specific attacks on trans people and really LGBTQ kids in general. So it's very, very scary, and it's becoming mainstream in the Republican Party. And we have to put a stop to it.
I know Republican and conservative politicians, as you mentioned too, going through the AIDS crisis and dealing with the Reagan administration, they've long targeted the LGBTQ community, marriage equality, gays in the military, these wedge issues, particularly during political campaigns all across the spectrum. But the wedge does seem wider. And just in the first 3 months of this year, from what I had read, lawmakers from these other states proposed more than 200 discriminatory bills targeting LGBTQ persons, young persons, students, athletes, their families, compared to, I saw the statistic, only 41 of such bills in 2018, for example. So it's more pernicious. It is different in 2022.
Yeah, they're much more brazen about it. They have no shame in these attacks on children primarily, who are already so vulnerable and at risk of suicide and self-harm, and they have no shame about increasing the risk of suicide for these kids. And so it's just a very traumatic time for a lot of people. And I feel bad for these kids. They're coming of age in a period of life that should be, it's always challenging to be a kid in a lot of ways, but it's joyful in a lot of ways, and you're exploring and learning, and there's a certain innocence about it. And then you have very powerful national politicians attacking you and saying that you're terrible and that you are a scam artist and you're a predator, and that's just very harmful for kids.
Well, and I know some of them positioned these bills or these rulings to protect LGBTQ young people from themselves, or protect young people from the pressure of having to identify as gay or non-binary or transgender, or even be accepting of those who do. And I know it's frustrating to look into the details of some of these, but let's talk about some of these bills that are cropping up, particularly the more provocative ones we've heard about, of the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, and then also Governor Abbott's ruling on those who are seeking transgender surgery and gender affirmation care, making this a crime, making it a witch hunt for families and the children and their families.
Yeah, I mean, what they're fundamentally trying to do is erase our community and basically say, if you exist, well, we don't like that you exist, but we want you to disappear. Don't talk about it. Just be in the closet, basically. And so they're trying to ban, and Florida did ban, even talking about any LGBTQ subject in school. So it becomes illegal in Florida, or it is now illegal in Florida for any age, K through 12, to teach about Harvey Milk, to teach about Stonewall, to teach about LGBTQ people in history, to teach about how Native American communities celebrated and uplifted trans people. That is now illegal in Florida. We see in Texas and other states, Alabama, banning gender-affirming care, threatening to put parents and doctors in prison and put the trans kids in foster care. And that's just a sampling of the kinds of laws that we're seeing, laws that ban trans kids from playing sports or bathroom bills. It's very, very alarming.
You had made the references to Nazism, and we sometimes get chastised when we use references to Nazis or the Holocaust when we talk about certain things. But in this particular case, really there are elements of even pre-Holocaust Nazi controls and censorship and attacks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think sometimes we can be dramatic in referring to Nazism. These are like actual Nazis,
right?
Like people who praise Adolf Hitler
Yes.
and actual fascists. So I'm not being dramatic in saying
No,
that.
not at all. No, and in fact, you mentioned the teaching. There's the censorship of the books. Conservatives are removing these books that feature LGBTQ characters. There's been like 1,100 plus books that have been banned in school districts all over the South and the Midwest. That really unparalleled in this country in decades, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have more censorship in this country, but that largely went away. And now, in some ways, they're trying to make it easier to get a gun than to get a book. And it just shows how misplaced their priorities are. And it's really undermining just basic freedoms.
It's hard to fathom the potentially devastating and divisive impact that these mandates and these laws are having on young people. Transgender youth considering surgery, their families who support them, students and teachers and allies who may be part of the community themselves. And I want to talk a little bit about that stigma and fear, which you've already touched on a bit, and the burden that faces the young people whose vulnerability and identity and sense of self is being exploited by politicians. There was the poll earlier this spring from the Trevor Project, which we've talked about before, the national nonprofit that focuses on LGBTQ youth in crisis, and they found that these toxic legislative debates have harmed the mental health of nearly 2/3 of LGBTQ children, and that psychologists are reporting that these children fear that God doesn't love them, the world won't accept them, that they should hide their true selves. I know you're not surprised by any of that.
These actions and words have consequences, and these kids, they're not sequestered somewhere. They're kids. They're on the internet. They have phones. They have computers. They have social media. They see the news. They know what's going on and what people are saying about them and how these political leaders are lying about them and slandering them, and it really does impact their sense of self-worth, and it creates doubt. And they also are lying. I mean, when we talk about gender-affirming care for kids, that is almost never surgery. Surgery is almost never happens for people below the age of 18. When we talk about gender-affirming care for teenagers, it's usually about puberty delayers or hormones, and surgery, if at all, happens later, but they make it seem like that 12-year-olds are getting gender confirming surgery, and that's just that's not happening. But they try to put fear into parents, and that's really just reprehensible.
What I understand and what I've learned more about, too, is that the more of those in the community, especially the young people, declaring their sexuality, declaring their gender affirmation, there's a visibility issue, that they put themselves out there. Yeah. They put themselves out there to be visible not only in their communities, but just out there in their families and their neighborhoods. And the visibility becomes a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I mean, that's the positive side, that more and more kids, for so many young people, it's just not an issue. They are who they are. They identify how they identify, and they're very comfortable expressing it, talking about it, and more parents are comfortable with it. I mean, it's a process, and there are a lot of parents who aren't comfortable, but more and more parents are either just very comfortable, or they at least understand that they need to get themselves comfortable with who their kids are. And that's a great thing. More of these LGBTQ kids have parents who are completely supportive and going out of their way to be good parents and to be supportive. And then you have people like Greg Abbott and other states coming in and saying, no, you're a child abuser if you allow your kid to get any kind of gender-affirming health care, no matter how minor or limited. And it's like an attack on these parents, and it's an attack on the doctors who are providing this care. So it's a good time for these kids in a lot of ways, but then there's the backlash that is very harmful.
In the last conversation we had a couple of years ago, you talked more in detail about growing up in New Jersey, coming out as a young gay man in 1990, in the arms of a supportive family. And you mentioned you marched in your first Pride Parade, I think you had said in 1994 in Philadelphia.
Yeah, somewhere
and with your family. And you talked about the love of your lesbian aunt and lesbian cousins. And you also told me that yourself, speaking of visibility, that being visible was a cautionary and risky process even for you at that time, and that you feared for your life. And in the course of that conversation, just because of schedule and moving on to other topics, I didn't get a chance to really let that hang out there and marinate, that you as a young man in your community in the 80s, early 90s, going to high school, declaring yourself gay, you had to fear for your life. You were a Jewish gay young man. Let's unpack that just a little bit more about how I'm sure there are young people now that could identify with the Scott Wiener of that time, growing up in that community and having that fear.
Well, I did not come out. I graduated high school in 1988, and I did not come out in high school, even though by the time I was a junior, I had admitted to myself that I was gay. And I didn't come out because it would have been very dangerous for me to come out in high school in the 1980s in suburban southern New Jersey. I ended up coming out when I was 20 in 1990, the beginning of my junior year of college. I finally worked up the nerve, and being in college, it was a little less risky, but there was still some harassment, and it was still not always pleasant. I think kids now, there are more and more kids who are in high school or even middle school are coming out, but there are still kids who get harassed and bullied. In high school, I was watching, there's a new show which is amazing on Netflix called Heartstopper, which is about a gay kid. I think they're a freshman or a sophomore who's out. He's out already, and his dating is coming out, and there's lesbians, but they all have to put up with a lot of bullying and harassment, even in 2022, and that is true for far too many kids. So we made a lot of progress since in the 32 years since I came out, but not nearly enough.
Well, even continuing the topic of visibility, particularly when it comes to trans youth who are considering gender-affirming treatments, they already face a bias and a stigma, as barriers to health care and social and economic obstacles keep them from having the surgery or at least this care. And there's often a huge disconnect between the healthcare providers and the trans youth, and then you complicate that sometimes with the terrorizing attitudes and even pushback from their families, and then you get these bills that criminalize the treatment. Here in California, actually, you have authored legislation, the first in the nation legislation, that would help create a more inclusive and culturally competent healthcare system for transgender and intersex persons in California. So tell us about SB 923, the TGI Inclusive Care Act.
So, for people who are trans, gender nonconforming, and intersex, there are plenty of healthcare providers who are very knowledgeable and supportive and provide terrific healthcare. This is not about broad brushing all healthcare providers, but there are healthcare providers who don't know what they're supposed to do in terms of treating someone, a TGI person, with respect, and others, unfortunately, who don't care and have no interest in treating TGI people with respect. So the bill requires some training as part of continuing education for, just basic cultural competency and how to, interact with a TGI patient, which of course will lead to better health outcomes because the patient will trust you more. And also creating a process to write some standards of conduct about how how they should be interacting with TGI patients. What it also does is something pretty basic but game-changing, I think, for a lot of TGI people, and that is to require health insurance companies, health plans, to have in their network directories a section of who the providers are who have indicated that they provide gender-affirming care. Because when you're a trans person and you want to get a physician, find a physician, a specialist who is, has experience working with trans people, a lot of times it's hard to find that. You have to just start cold calling to figure it out, and it's not easy. And so having that section of the directory that has a list for you will be very helpful to a lot of people. Because a lot of times in modern healthcare system, you are dealing with your insurance company, dealing with representatives, with healthcare professionals who are working at the insurance companies, and you have to be able to talk to people, and we want to make sure they also have just a basic level of understanding. We're not talking about massive amounts of training. This is just basic levels of understanding.
And I've even heard where sometimes the patients, the young people, wind up having to educate their healthcare providers on being transgender and what the surgery means, and educate them into the community. It's almost like they're having to teach the doctors.
Yeah, and that's always going to happen in some ways. You have to be willing to talk to your physician. The physician's not going to be all knowledgeable about everything. But we want to at least have some baseline understanding, so that if you're a trans person and you go to see a doctor, the doctor at least knows something and is maybe attuned to, okay, let's make sure I use the correct pronouns, and let's make sure I understand some of the terminology. It's just sometimes it's the little things that aren't so little.
Mm-hmm. I know that some young people are asking to bring in more transgender healthcare providers who have gone through this experience themselves and have that extra sensitivity. Are there more and more transgender healthcare providers out there?
Well, I think there are definitely more and more LGBTQ healthcare providers in general. I don't know the numbers for how many trans, physicians there are. For example, there certainly are, but we always want more. And you don't have to be a trans provider to provide good care. I mean, my primary care physician is a straight guy in his late 70s. He's my doctor for a long time, and he's been fantastic. When I went to him and said, 10 years ago, and said I wanted to go on PrEP, where a lot of physicians didn't even know what PrEP was and were probably judgmental about it, he immediately knew what it was and was very non-judgmental. And so you can have a physician who's not of the same community as you, but if they know what they're talking about and they have some level of understanding, they can do a great job.
And I know there's concerns, too, for transgender persons of color, even transgender persons in rural communities who sometimes have an extra difficult time seeking access to the appropriate health care.
Well, I think, first of all, in general, people of color have had struggles with the healthcare system, and that's even more so for trans people of color. And so when you're a particular, trans person of color, particularly a black trans woman, you have so many different obstacles you're trying to overcome in the healthcare system, and it can be, I think, overwhelming. And society puts it on you to be an educator, to advocate for yourself, when you shouldn't really have to do that. And hopefully we will have a world sooner rather than later where you don't have to do that.
Right. This bill reminds us of our state's continued progressive visibility and policy strength for those communities and states across the country who seek access to vital health care services and support that is illegal where they are right now. I've had conversations here on this podcast with Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins and other colleagues of yours in the Democratic caucus about the plan to position California as a sanctuary, as a refuge for women across the country seeking reproductive health care, seeking abortion access in areas where it's now illegal or they can't get it. And it does sound like now that you and other progressive lawmakers and advocates are doing the same thing here for transgender youth and others in the community across the country. Coming to California, moving to California, seeking this care here, come unto us. We are here. We are welcoming. We have these services available, and housing, a lot of other services, not just health care. Are you positioning the community, positioning California as that welcoming open door to others across the country?
Yeah, I introduced legislation, Senate Bill 107, that does just that, and modeled in part over some of the work that our colleagues in the Women's Caucus are doing around abortion, but then adding some additional features that my colleagues in the Women's Caucus are then borrowing. So we've been borrowing ideas back and forth. And SB 107 will allow people who need to leave their state because they're being investigated or they're scared that they're going to be investigated because they allowed their kid to have gender-affirming care, to say you can come to California and we're going to do everything we can not to enforce that other state's law. We're not going to honor their subpoenas. Our law enforcement's not going to cooperate with them, and we're going to do everything we can to avoid extraditing you or otherwise facilitating their oppression of you.
California has not been so
progressive in the past. We have not always been this bastion of welcomingness and open-mindedness. There was a proposition back in 1978 that was defeated that would have prohibited gays and lesbians from teaching in schools. And, of course, you remember Prop 8 and the battle of that in the early 2000s dealing with gay marriage. So California has some bruises and some black marks. But what makes us different now? What's different about us versus the other states?
It's been an evolution. California used to be a less progressive state. It wasn't until the mid to late 90s that we even had an LGBTQ civil rights law. And, of course, Prop 8 passed in 2008. There were efforts to put people living with HIV into concentration camps. And so there have been some challenges. But in the last 15 years, we really hit a tipping point. The state became much more progressive, much better about LGBTQ equality. And so it's a very different place now.
Recent stats I've seen show that 41% of American parents support teaching or discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity in classroom. A third of Republicans out there say that they're comfortable with it. And even though Republicans have made progress on LGBTQ issues, they are still reflexively mired in this attachment to gay bigotry. Your SB 923, it has moved on from the Senate. It's now moving through the Assembly. And even in the California legislature, we've seen a lot of bills, many of which you've authored, that have passed the legislature, gone to the governor's desk, and signed into law. And yet a lot of conservatives in the legislature, your colleagues, Republicans, are opposing them. Why do the Republican legislators vote time and time again against LGBTQ-related bills?
Yeah, I have to say it's hard. I mean, I have a good relationship with just about all of my Republican colleagues in both houses, and I work with them on issues, sometimes on housing or mental health or some drug addiction issues, and we have a good personal relationship. On these issues, the politics in the Republican Party towards the LGBT community are just completely toxic. And so, yeah, it's disappointing when we do a resolution to commemorate Harvey Milk Day and no Republicans vote for it. They don't vote against it, but they abstain. And they have their politics. I just think it's sad. The politics in the Republican Party are so rough. And I know that I have Republican colleagues who I don't believe that they all believe that those votes are correct inside. Mm-hmm. I don't want to judge them. They cast their own votes. They have their own beliefs. But I think the politics in the Republican Party around LGBTQ people are just off the rails. And I thought that maybe that would start shifting over time, but now it's gotten worse than it was 5 years ago. I've learned in politics just not to take it. It's hard not to take it personally, sure. But I work really hard not to take it personally because I have to represent my constituents, and that means being able to work with all of my colleagues and have relationships with my colleagues and find common ground with my colleagues, even when some of the disagreements hurt. And that's my responsibility because for me to be the most effective representative for my constituents, I have to be able to persuade people who I have strong disagreements with to align with me on issues where we can align. And if I am taking everything personally, as hard as that it is not to do that, it makes the job in general harder.
Indeed. Well, for that matter, should Democrats across the country be speaking up more about what's going on in this country, in the legislatures, even in the federal government? Should Democrats be getting as mad or being as progressively active as Senator Scott Wiener is in pushing back against these draconian laws?
Yes, and I think a lot of Democrats around the country are. And so, and we have a lot of things to be mad about when we see what's happening with abortion access, when we see the carnage with gun violence, when we see what's happening with the attacks on democracy and voting rights. There's a lot for people to be angry about, and people definitely need to be angry about the attacks on the LGBTQ community, and I think they are.
Well, we talked about abortion. The comment has been since the draft of the intended upcoming ruling of the court regarding Roe v. Wade and ending abortion, making abortion illegal in this country. A lot of the word has been, if Roe v. Wade fails, next thing we're coming for is gay marriage. Just wait till states start jailing women for having abortions, and in the next cell it's going to be a same-sex couple that were married. Is that provocative, or is that really, can you see that happening in this country?
I do. I mean, we have somewhere between 3 and 5 justices who are taking very radical views, obviously about abortion, but we could see it happening with marriage equality. But beyond marriage equality, they could start striking down civil rights laws to say that civil rights laws that protect LGBTQ people from employment discrimination, housing discrimination, that those violate the First Amendment. We've already seen it where they said that someone who I think was like making wedding cakes didn't have to make a wedding cake for a gay couple. And so if they keep going down that path, we could see a wholesale overturning of LGBTQ state civil rights protections, which ending marriage equality would be atrocious, horrific, and a nightmare. But getting rid of employment and housing protections is even more basic in some ways, because that's just your ability to survive. And so this court scares me. There are members of this, people who should not be on the Supreme Court.
Absolutely.
And who are just completely radical.
Well, as a scared gay man, a lawmaker in the progressive state of California, as cliche as this question sounds, what do you say to those out there in other states who are as scared as you are about what's going on directly in their own states, looking to California perhaps as a place where they can feel accepted and receive treatment, receive social help that they're not getting or can't get in their own states? What do you say to them?
Well, first, be strong and keep fighting and never give up, and know that we are one united LGBTQ community everywhere. And, you know, a few years ago, the Fresno Pride Committee asked me to be a Grand Marshal in their parade. This was in 2019. So I went down to Fresno. It was a really lovely, wonderful day. The community was very welcoming. Fresno is a very different place politically than San Francisco, but I felt very connected to the LGBTQ people in Fresno. And that's true everywhere I've ever been, including small towns, different parts of the country where there are queer people there. Like, we're all connected in a lot of ways, and we have to be there for each other.
And on that note, as we wrap here, I know the people are scared, the people are afraid, people are angry in the community. And in fact, that anger sometimes is galvanizing enough for them to take action, to become advocates, to become support of their community, of others, their peers that are dealing with the same kind of issues. 12, 13 years old, they're advocates in their own communities. Yeah. They've had to grow up, you could say, unfairly faster than they might have otherwise in this world, but they're in ascendance as future leaders and survivors and leading this new generation of gay and lesbian and trans youth who are coming into their identities and are joining the fight against the opposition. So in some ways, I guess that's some grace and affirmation in the midst of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are going to win in the end, as painful as this period is. It is important for people to channel their anger into action, and that means activism and just engagement in your community, engagement in your kids' school, engagement at City Hall, engagement in your local neighborhood association, but also people running for office, because we ultimately need ourselves and our allies to be in office. And we need to hold our allies accountable for being there for our community, for not being scared to stand up for us.
Thank you so much for your time. It's great to have you and your conversation. Have a wonderful Pride this month, even in spite of everything that we've been talking about. I hope it's a strong and happy Pride, and let's do this again sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. State Senator Scott Wiener of San Francisco. That is a wrap for this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical and production assistance from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, and the graphic artistry of Tam Davis. I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.